Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. I understand that the other Josh Powers, walked you through one of the important tools of the trade for our course, which is artificial neural networks. You're all neural network experts by now? Maybe yes, maybe no. Hopefully you have enough understanding of neural networks that generally speaking, they are a function which transforms values arriving at the input layer into values at the output layer. And by fiddling with the weights of the synapses that connect neurons between the input and output layer, you can alter that function. Obviously, neural networks can be put to lots of different, can be applied to lots of different problems. Obviously here we're going to be using neural networks inside our robots, where the values arriving at the input layer are information coming from the robot's world through its sensors, and it is transforming those sensory values using the synapses and the neurons inside the neural network into values arriving at the output layer. And what happens to the values at the output layer from there? How are they used by the robot, generally speaking?
Like input a motor or like control something on the motor given the input?
Absolutely. So we're going to take those values and we're going to send them to the motors, and how the motors interpret those numbers we'll talk about when we talk about physical simulation, right? We're going from the internal world of the neural network back to the real world, where those values can be forces or torques that are going to cause the robot to move, which alters its relationship relative to the world, which alters the values falling on its input layer, falling on the sensors, which goes into the input layer, and around we go, right? So that's the idea of artificial neural networks. We're mostly talk about a second tool of the trade today, which is evolutionary algorithms. So if we want our robot to do something, presumably there is some set of synaptic weights out there that will transform the various sensor values in just the right way so that the robot does the right thing, given what it's currently sensing at that point in time. But what are those synapse values? They're very, very difficult to do by hand. As Josh P. probably showed you last time, it's hard to sit down and actually figure out what the synaptic weight should be, even for a very simple neural network that computes a simple function like AND or exclusive or. We're going to get into much more complicated transformations from sensors to motors. It's beyond most humans' intuition, so we're going to use an evolutionary algorithm to try and discover what those weights are. And then towards the end of the course, we're going to broaden our evolutionary algorithm so that it's not just tinkering with the internals of the neural network controller, it is also tinkering with aspects of the robot's physical body. That's where we're going. We may or may not finish lecture 5 today. If we do, we will move on to lecture 6 on physical simulation. Again, a topic that could take up an entire course. We're just going to touch on the basics of physical simulation that are relevant to simulating robots and evolving them. Okay, let's talk about the assignments for a moment. So undergraduates, you're moving on to assignment 3. You've now created an empty simulator and you've sent to that simulator one or more objects. You've connected those objects together with one or more joints, where we now have basically a passive mechanical structure. We don't have a robot yet. So in assignment 3, you're going to be adding sensors to your robot. So we're going to start to build the input layer of eventually the neural network. So the robot is going to be able, at the end of assignment 3, to sense aspects of its environment. But since we haven't connected the sensors to the motors yet through a neural network, it's not going to be able to act on that sensory information. As you will see, as you're working through assignment 3, when you get down to step 23 here, you're going to be asked to install the matplotlib Python library. How many of you have worked with matplotlib before? Wow, almost all of you. Okay, that's fine. If you have not, that's fine. I would suggest while you have some time now at the beginning of the semester, if you're not familiar to matplotlib, go find an online tutorial, work your way through the basics of matplotlib. We're not going to use much of matplotlib in assignment 3, but you're going to be using this as a secondary visualization tool in this course. Obviously, the primary visualization tool is the simulator itself, but Some of the things that the robot experiences we can't see directly in the simulator, like the values arriving at its sensors. So we're going to use matplotlib, or you're going to use matplotlib to visualize sensor data. And you should get something that looks like, not that, let's see. I had it here somewhere. Oh yeah, okay, something that looks like this. So we have time on the horizontal axis, which goes, in this case, from 0 to 100. And what are these 100? These are the 100 time steps that elapse in the physical simulation before it ends. And we'll talk about time steps and how time is measured in physical simulations shortly. But we have basically the quote-unquote lifetime of the robot. And over that time, it has, in this case, just a single sensor. And that value starts at 2, drops to 0, goes back up to 2, stays at 2, drops to 0, and stays at 0 for the rest of the robot's lifetime. So you're going to be submitting in assignment 3 and some of the other assignments what the robot is seeing or sensing using matplotlib. If you're not familiar with matplotlib, or you're a little rusty, work your way through a tutorial this week before tackling assignment 3. Okay. Graduate students, you're moving on to assignments 5 and 6. Any questions about the assignments before we jump back to lecture? All good? Okay. So, second tool of the trade, evolutionary algorithms. This, again, is a massive topic. We're going to look at a bunch of evolutionary algorithms today. And starting in assignment, I always forget whether it's 5 or 6, somewhere in there, when you finish coding up the objects, joints, sensors, motors, neurons, and synapses, once you have all 6 components in your robot, you're then going to start implementing a series of more powerful evolutionary algorithms that wrap around your physical simulator. And we'll talk about some of them today. Basic idea of evolutionary algorithms, as the name implies, it's a bio-inspired algorithm. It's inspired by biology, and in this case, Darwinian evolution. If you're a computer scientist and you learn about Darwinian evolution, you can often view it as a kind of algorithm. We have a population of organisms. These organisms have some genetic variation. That genetic variation causes variation in their behavior or their physiology. That variation causes some of them to do a better job at surviving in their ecological niche and surviving long enough to produce offspring, which inherit their genetic material. Those that don't do so well are killed off or don't produce offspring. And as Darwin showed us, if you loop through this algorithm long enough, you often end up with organisms that are tuned to their ecological niche. As I mentioned last week, they are not optimal. They are usually satisfactory. They are good enough to survive and reproduce in their environment. So more than 40 years ago, when computer science was just getting started, actually the first PhD awarded in computer science was about the genetic algorithm. I'm going to use the term evolutionary algorithms and genetic algorithms for our purposes. Evolutionary algorithm is going to be a catch-all term for lots of different kinds of evolutionary algorithms. There are thousands of different evolutionary algorithms that have now been reported in the literature. One of the more common ones that a lot of people have heard of is the genetic algorithm. Basic idea here is we have, instead of a population of organisms, in a genetic algorithm, we usually have a population of vectors. And those vectors encode somehow, they encode a candidate solution to a given problem. We haven't said what the solution is or what the problem is here, but we can think of the DNA in a genetic algorithm as a vector of numbers. We decode those numbers like DNA is decoded into the actual solution. We evaluate, or the computer evaluates the quality of each of these candidate solutions. And the poorer solutions are deleted. The better solutions survive. And the better solutions, we make randomly modified copies of those surviving solutions or those surviving vectors, right? Again, this is just sort of a cartoon overview of a genetic algorithm at the moment, but all of the evolutionary algorithms that we're going to talk about today have this basic structure. They're population-based. At any one time, we don't have just one solution. We have a population of hopefully diverse solutions. We have some way of measuring the quality or the fitness of any one member of the population. Poorer ones are deleted. Better ones, we produce randomly modified copies. And all the variation the different evolutionary algorithms that we're going to talk about today instantiate that basic algorithm in slightly different ways. Obviously, the field of evolutionary robotics, as we talked about before, what is the problem and what is the solution? Well, the problem is some dirty, dangerous, distant, or dull task, the 4 Ds. There's something that we would like a machine to do that a human would prefer not to do. That's the problem. The solution, any given candidate solution, is a machine that is better or worse at performing that dangerous, dull, distant, or dirty job. Okay. Here's just, again, we've seen some already. Here's an example of, for some reason, I'm not able to play this. Okay, I will have to show you this video later. Let me talk you through what you would see if this was working. On the left, we're evolving a robot to brachiate, which is the primate's ability to swing from branch to branch. Most primates are pretty good at this. This particular primate species is not very good at that. Gibbons are the masters of this. If you ever go to the zoo, make sure to see the gibbons brachiating. They're amazing. We evolved this robot to basically just move along this virtual beam. This virtual robot has a series of blocks attached to it, which are the batteries. So this was work we did almost 20 years ago. So we had some pretty heavy batteries on board the robot. And you can go and watch this video at your leisure. What you will notice is as this robot moves along the beam, it actively swings these heavy batteries underneath it and uses the momentum generated by the swinging of the batteries to decide when to let go and move on to the next handhold. One of the nice things about evolution, using evolution to design autonomous machines, is not just that an evolutionary algorithm gives us diverse solutions. Evolution usually gives us solutions that exploit the agent's interaction with its environment. So not only did evolution produce a successful brachiator, which we then translated into reality, but the way in which evolution solved this problem was exploiting interactions with the environment. If I gave you this robot, you could probably create a controller that would get the robot to let go, move its hand, grab, let go, move its hand, and grab, but that robot would move slowly. This robot moves pretty quickly because it's exploiting the throwing of its own weight. If I asked you to write a controller that would do that, much more difficult. So just an illustration of, again, why we would want to use evolution to try and design autonomous machines. Okay, so if we put a genetic algorithm or an evolutionary algorithm together with robotics, we get the field of evolutionary robotics. Okay, so we're going to pause for a moment now. We're going to switch from robotics to evolutionary biology. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about evolutionary algorithms today. The best way to understand these algorithms and to understand the similarities and differences between them is to use a thought tool that was invented almost 100 years ago by an evolutionary biologist, Sewell Wright. This is an abstract concept known as the fitness landscape. It's a way to think about populations of organisms that are evolving, or in our case, populations of robots that are evolving. So I want you to picture an abstract landscape. Let's start with the two-dimensional landscape that you see in the upper left here. Let's imagine that we have just one parameter that describes our robot. That one parameter is going to be our one quote-unquote gene. As you'll see when we talk about evolutionary algorithms, we're going to use a lot of terms from biology. We're going to adapt them to our purposes. You could, for example, imagine a simple robot with a simple neural network, and inside that robot's neural network is one synapse with one weight. That's our one gene. We can then ask the question, what is a good value of that single synapse to get the robot to do what we want it to do? And we could imagine, if we create this one horizontal dimension here, that every point along this horizontal dimension is a particular value for that gene, or that synapse in this case. We can then ask, if we chose that gene value and sent it to the robot, how well would the robot do at whatever we want it to do? Assuming we're able to quantify the behavior of our robot or our organism and boil that quantification down to a single number, then we can add a second dimension, fitness, and the height of the point at that horizontal position is the value or the quality or the fitness of that robot. So using our previous example, if we have our brachiator and we give the synapse this particular weight, the robot does a very poor job at brachiating. If instead we give the same robot a different synaptic weight, that robot does a much better job at brachiating, where we're going to measure brachiation with just a single number, which is how far it travels along the beam. So far, so good? Okay. So we're going to talk about genotypes and phenotypes. The genotype is the blueprint of the organism or the robot. In the case of organisms, the genotype is the DNA. In the case of our robots, the genotype is a vector of numbers or some data structure that encodes some version of the robot. The phenotype is the decoding of the genotype into the thing. So if the genotype is the blueprint, then the phenotype is the thing itself. The genotype is the blueprint of a bridge. The phenotype is the bridge itself. The shape of the bridge, how strong it is, the kinds of vehicles that can and cannot cross the bridge. So we're going to keep this distinction in mind. The genotype describes the thing, and the phenotype is the thing itself. Okay, so if our genotype is one-dimensional, meaning it contains just one gene value, then our fitness landscape has two dimensions. It has one dimension for each dimension of the genotype, and an additional vertical dimension, which is the fitness, right? If we think about a slightly more complex robot, and that robot has two synapses inside its neural network controller, then we can imagine pairs of values for those, pairs of weights for those two synapses, which specifies a position in a two-dimensional horizontal plane, right? If you think about any point horizontally in this three-dimensional space, that corresponds to a particular pair of weights, and the height, as always, represents how well the robot does or how poorly the robot does. So for any robot that has n genes, the fitness landscape always has a dimensionality of n plus 1. So I've got a picture here for a hypothetical robot with one synapse, a landscape for two synapses. Why is there no picture for a robot with three synapses? You can't visualize it, and I can't draw it because it would be in 4 dimensions, right? So this is why the fitness landscape is a thought experiment. We're now going to leave 2 and 3 dimensions and move into a very high dimensional space. For most of the robots you're going to be developing in this course, your robot may have a dozen, 20, 30, 100 synapses, which means if you have a robot with 100 synapses, the evolutionary algorithm is moving about a 101-dimensional fitness landscape. Yeah? So hold these low-dimensional pictures in your mind, and we'll use this to try and guide your intuition about similarities and differences between evolutionary algorithms. So far, so good. Any questions about fitness landscapes? Okay, so let's put it to work. And we're going to use the fitness landscape here to think about a series of increasingly powerful evolutionary algorithms. We're going to start with the simplest one you can possibly imagine, which is nicknamed the hill climber. It is very simple. You can write a hill climber in about 6 lines of Python code, which is wonderful. But obviously, because it's so simple, it must have a drawback. There must be a reason why people develop more complex evolutionary algorithms. So we're going to march along increasingly powerful evolutionary algorithms and try and identify the strengths and weaknesses of them as we go. Okay, as we describe each of these evolutionary algorithms, I'm also putting this little cartoon to the left, which is, again, just a summary of the basic evolutionary algorithm, which has basically 5 steps. We're going to initialize a population of initially random solutions, just create a bunch of random solutions, score each element in the population, select a subset of those that are allowed to survive and reproduce, the others die off, make randomly modified copies of the survivors, and repeat this process until some termination criterion is reached. This could be 8 hours on your laptop overnight, and at the end of 8 hours, the evolutionary algorithm gives you back the best element in the population. Or you could loop through this until you evolve some robot that has some certain fitness threshold. You're going to keep running things until you get a robot that is as good as this. It's up to you. Okay. Why is the hill climber so simple? Because it has a population of 1. So the unique thing about the hill climber is it really doesn't have a population of solutions. There's just 1 hill climber. We're going to start by calling that initial random set of values P for parent. And over here, we've got a vector of values. But of course, I wouldn't be able to draw the fitness landscape for that. So again, let's imagine that our little hill climber here has just 1 synapse, 1 weight, 1 parameter, 1 gene. Okay, so let's imagine that we chose actually not too badly. It's actually doing okay. The height always tells us the fitness of that potential solution. We take that parent and we make a randomly modified copy of it. We copy all of the values, and as we're copying across the values into the child, every once in a while we make a mistake. Why do we make a mistake? Seems like an odd thing to introduce into a computer algorithm. Why would we intentionally include mistakes?
For genetic variation.
For genetic variation, right? We're simulating mutation in a very, very simple way for now. In this cartoon example, let's imagine that this slightly modified genotype over here produces a slightly worse phenotype, whatever that is. What do you think we do at this point? We have 2 vectors, P and C. Throw out C, right? We compare P to C. C is worse, so we throw out C. We go back to P. P produces another child. That one is also worse. Throw that away. It produces a 3rd child. That child is actually a little bit better than the parent. What do we do with P and C at this point? Would you imagine, given the name of the algorithm? Discard P. We have 2 solutions. C is better than P, so we throw away P, and now we only have C. We rename C to P. It's the new parent. It produces a child of its own, and we repeat this process. And as you can imagine, very slowly, it will climb this hill. Awesome. Simple algorithm, automatic improvement. What's the problem? Why aren't we all implementing hill climbers?
You'll land at a local maximum, but maybe not the actual maximum.
Exactly. So we're going to introduce some new terminology here, which you just mentioned, which is local optima, or local optimum. So why local? Well, local comes from, again, the fitness landscape. So if we think about a landscape and we look in just the local neighborhood, in this local neighborhood, there is 1 optimum, which is this one right here, right? So if we run a hill climber, it will climb the local hill and pretty quickly get to the local optimum. But usually we're not looking for the local optimum. We want to try, assuming we have enough computational power to do so, we would like to try and find the global optimum, which is over the entire fitness landscape, what is the best solution. Remember that you and I can see this fitness landscape. Again, it's a cartoon. We think we can see it. The evolutionary algorithm, however, cannot see this landscape. It can only see the heights of the points that it's reached so far. A way to think about this is if you go climbing in the Green Mountains on a very, very foggy day, you cannot see the mountain at all All you can do is see sort of the step in front of you, and you have an altimeter on your belt, which records your current height. So every time you take a step, you can record the height. If you stepped higher, stay there. If you took a step and you went down, reverse your step. And after you finish climbing, all you can see is the data from your altimeter, right? And at some point, if you climb the Green Mountains on a very foggy day, you'll eventually get somewhere where if you take a step in any direction, you always go down. Are you at the top of Mount Mansfield, right? Are you at the global optimum? You can't tell, right? Okay. So there's an obvious limitation here, which is the hill climber usually gets stuck on a local optima. It's unlikely that it's going to land on the slope of a higher hill. So can we create a slightly more complex evolutionary algorithm that is slightly less likely to get stuck on local optima? Well, an obvious step is to work with not just one hill climber, but a bunch of hill climbers in parallel. So the parallel hill climber, as the name implies, is just a parallel version of the hill climber. We're going to start by creating a population of random parents, and they're going to fall at different points in the fitness landscape. And each of them is going to start doing local climbing by producing children and replacing children with parents and so on. As you can see here, we actually didn't do much better. Lineage 1 is going to eventually get here, and lineage 2 is eventually going to get here, but we missed the mountain. We only hit the hills. So how do we do better? What's the simplest thing we could do here to increase our chances of landing on the mountain?
Create more parents.
Create more parents, right? Just create a larger population. And I think in assignment 6 or 7, you'll get an opportunity to try this. As you create a larger and larger population, you have a more and more likely chance of getting lucky, that someone is going to land on the slope of maybe not the global mountain, but at least a very significant, close to optimal solution. What's the problem with just increasing the population size? It's got an obvious advantage. What's the disadvantage?
You can still all get dumped on the sides and never reach the global.
We can't guarantee that we're ever going to reach the global optimum, so we'll just keep cranking it up. We'll create a population of 100, 1,000, 1,000,000. What's the problem? You run out of computation. Some of you have faster laptops than others. You can try running a parallel hill climber with 10 million solutions. It's going to take you a while to get anywhere, right? So we're stuck now between a rock and a hard place. We know how to make things better, make a bigger population, simplest thing. It only adds like 2 lines of code to your code base, but it's computationally inefficient. So can we create yet another algorithm, which is slightly more complicated, which increases our chances of finding the global optimum without having to just crank through more and more computation? That's where the genetic algorithm comes in. The genetic algorithm is like a parallel hill climber. We're going to start with the population of vectors. In the traditional genetic algorithm, these would not be floating point numbers. They'd be binary numbers. But that's sort of a historical artifact. It doesn't matter for our purposes how we encode the number. So for our purposes in this class, we just consider floats. The difference between the genetic algorithm and the parallel hill climber is it's going to introduce one additional evolutionary mechanism that actually took evolution, Mother Nature, quite a while to figure out, which is sex. So we've got a bunch of lineages here that are climbing their local hills. And if you think about P1 and P2 for a moment, if we think about the genotypes themselves, the genotypes might, if we're lucky, be complementary. And what do I mean by that? It could mean that one parent has part of the solution correct, but the other part incorrect. And the other parent has the other part correct and the other part incorrect. If we cut these 2 vectors and unglue them and glue them together to produce C1 and take the other 2 parts, so let's walk through this. Let's take the left part of P1 and the right part of P2 and put them together to produce C1. So C1 has its left genes are from P1 and its right genes are from P2. We can also create C2, which inherits its left genes from parent 2 and its right genes from parent 1. If we choose the right parents that have two complementary parts correct, and we cut at just the right part, we can end up with a child that gets the best of both worlds. It gets the two correct subcomponents from both parents, and that lucky C1 is now on its way to the global optimum. Sounds good, right? This is the reason why Mother Nature discovered sex. It often works that you can bring together in a modular fashion correct solutions to subproblems. If you'll remember from Josh P's discussion of neural networks, he walked you through a neural network that computed the exclusive OR function, XOR. If you'll remember, there were two halves of that neural network. One half computed the AND function, the other half computed the OR function, and they then combined those two partial solutions, right? Imagine we have a population of neural networks. They're all evolving to solve the exclusive OR problem. One neural network in the population has solved the AND problem, but is messing up on the OR part. A second neural network in the population has solved the OR problem. The synaptic weights are correct, but it's messing up the AND part. Imagine that we were to cut those two neural networks in half and bring the correct AND together with the correct OR. We might end up with a child that perfectly solves XOR or does better than either parents. Right? That's kind of the intuition here. Sounds good in theory. Some problems here, though, to make this work in reality.
It's hard to know what parts are working and what parts aren't.
Which parts are working and which aren't, right? Macs and PCs, they have pros and cons. So I'm going to take one of your Macs and one of your PCs and randomly cut them in half and glue the two halves of those laptops together. And I'm probably going to get a laptop that is better than a Mac alone or a PC alone, right? Probably not, right? It's extremely unlikely. So sexual recombination has potential if it's done right, but it turns out that in practice, it's very difficult to get this to work well. And that's one of the theories why it took Mother Nature so long to invent sex in the history of life. It was a relatively late invention, probably because it's hard to get all the pieces in place through blind reproduction and selection to get to the point where cutting two pieces of DNA in half and randomly gluing them together works. It's notoriously difficult. We'll come back to this problem later in the course and look at an algorithm that actually tries to solve this problem. But for now, we can see that at least in theory, recombination, if done right, is much more useful than just having a whole bunch of independent solutions seeking the global optimum. So far, so good? Okay. There's another issue here, which is what happens if instead of searching a fitness landscape that looks like this, unbeknownst to the evolutionary algorithm, because remember it can't see the fitness landscape, it's actually traversing a landscape that looks like this. So we're going to now start talking about smooth and rough fitness landscapes. If you have a rough fitness landscape, what does that mean? Why is it so difficult for an evolutionary algorithm if the landscape is rough? Yes? What do you mean by multimodal here? There's too many peaks. There's too many peaks, but so what? Too many from... Absolutely. There are many, many local optima in the lower picture and only one global maximum, so we're much more likely to get stuck. When you're evolving populations of robots, as you will find in assignment 9 and 10, when you get towards the end, the fitness landscape is much more like this than it is like this. Okay, so what does it mean to have a rough fitness landscape? Imagine we're at this point here. Let's imagine for the moment we just have one solution. Let's imagine that this point corresponds to a neural network that's inside a bipedal robot, a two-legged robot. As you can see, this point is actually pretty high already. So let's imagine we've done some evolution, and we now have a neural network controller that allows the robot to take 1, 2, 3 steps, and then it falls over. So we're actually almost at bipedal locomotion, and we go in and make a random change to one of the synaptic weights in that controller. What do you think happens to the biped?
Go either way, and
You're not actually, you're pretty sure about what's going to happen. It took 3.5 steps before, and I go in and make a random change. What do you think is going to most likely to happen in that new controller?
same.
Not only is it not going to take more steps, but you're probably disrupted this good solution you already have, and it's going to take no steps. If I grab one of your laptops and open it up, and with the soldering iron change one of the wires on your motherboard at random, your computer is not going to run slightly slower, right? It's done. That's it, right? So when you're talking about rough fitness landscapes, what that means is you're usually dealing with a complicated machine where even if you're able to make any progress, any step in one direction is game over, right? So they're not just more peaks, but it's very difficult to use this hill climbing idea to take one step in a random location, right? So let's have a look at this in terms of the smooth fitness landscape to start with. Let's imagine we have a smooth fitness landscape and we're sitting here. We're going to now introduce evolution strategies, which introduce a new idea, which is step size, or if we're thinking about this from a biological point of view, mutation magnitude. How big a change are we going to make? In this cartoon example here, we're going to define a step size of 0.1, which means when we modify the value of gene 1 for this solution, we can take the current value and add anywhere from plus 0.1 to minus 0.1 from that current value. We could define a step size of 0.01, which means we're going to take smaller steps. If we have a step size of 0.1, and which I've drawn on here, for any value for any value where we're subtracting 0.01 up to adding 0.01, what is the probability in this cartoon that the solution is going to get better? So we're sitting here, we can add any value between minus 0.1 to plus 0.1 to it, any value in between. For any of those changes, for any of the potential children in this range, what's the probability the child will be better than the parent? 0.5. It's about 50-50, right? If we subtract any value from the current value, we're going to get a child that's better than the parent. If we add any positive value, it's going to get worse, 50-50. That's actually really good, right? Okay, let's take that same step size of 0.1 and apply it to this parent in a rough fitness landscape. What is the chance now that things are going to get better? What's that? 10%, right? It's not very good at all. If you go climbing somewhere other than the Green Mountains, somewhere out west where there's lots of crevices, you better climb very carefully, right? Because most steps in any direction will take you down, and not just take you down, but take you down by a large amount, right? Very difficult to make progress in this case. So now we need to think about not just which direction to take a step in, but what should be the magnitude of the step, right? We don't know because remember that these landscapes are shrouded in fog. The algorithm can't see. If it's randomly taking 0.1 steps away from its current solution, that's not going to work very well. So how do we know what the step size should be? If we're in a rough fitness landscape, steps should be very, very small. If we take very, very small steps in a smooth fitness landscape, what's the problem with that? Let's go climb the Green Mountains and we'll take 1 millimeter steps. It's going to take forever, right? So there's some sweet spot in between given the fitness landscape, and we usually don't know a priori what that step size should be. So we now have a problem that's non-intuitive. And as is our usual lazy way in evolutionary algorithms, if we don't have a good intuition for it, we're going to turn it over to evolution. Let it decide what the step size should be. That's the intuition behind the evolution strategy. So in the evolution strategy, the genotype, remember, which is the blueprint, is no longer a one-dimensional vector. It is a 2 by n vector. For every gene, there is an associated step size with it. As I mentioned, we usually don't know what those step sizes are. So at the beginning, when we initialize the population of these vectors, we assign random step sizes to each gene, which indicates that if we mutate any one gene, we're going to mutate it by adding or subtracting within this range. So in this case, we can see that gene number 2 has a relatively big step size. If we mutate gene 2, given this step size, and the child is better than the parent, what does that tell us about this step size? It's actually pretty good, right? So we'll copy that new child. We've randomly modified it. We've copied it and leave the step size alone. If instead we take this vector and we copy it and we make a modification to gene 1 according to this step size, and it gets worse, the child is worse, we produce another child where we also mutate gene 1 according to this step size. It's also worse. We do that a few more times. What does that tell us about the step size associated with gene 1? It's not good. So what do you think we do at that point? Or what does evolution do at that point? Change the step size. So we mutate the step size now rather than the gene itself. Okay, kind of makes sense.
What's the step size for the step size?
Good, excellent question, right? It's turtles all the way down if you're a physicist. There's a problem of infinite regress here, which is also what's the step size of the step size and what's the step size of the step size of the step size. No one has a good answer to that yet, but that becomes less problematic the more times you iterate through that. So the step size for the step sizes matters less than the step size for the genes themselves. There's still a problem, but it kind of disappears as you recurse out. Okay. So that's the idea of evolution strategies. Some of you may have heard of CMAES. It's got this cryptic term. There's evolution strategies. This stands for covariance matrix adaptation. This is the most common evolutionary algorithm used in practice. It adds one more innovation to an evolutionary strategy. We're not going to talk about it in this class. It requires a little bit more math. But if you're interested in using evolutionary algorithms, you can find CMAES libraries for Python, and it sort of runs it under the hood for you. It's a very, very powerful evolutionary algorithm. And for most people, it's considered the state of the art. Okay, let's switch and look at a quite different evolutionary algorithm. Before we introduce the evolutionary algorithm itself, let's introduce a different problem. So we're going to step outside of robotics for a moment, and we're going to talk about regression. So what is regression? Let me skip ahead and I'll come back to this. In regression, we have a bunch of observations. So you may have seen this in introductory science classes. We have an x here, and at each x, we take a measurement, which is our y, gives us a scatter plot. And we'd like to see if there's any pattern in this data. Can we find a line, an equation, y equals some function of x, that describes or draws a curve through these points, right? You've all heard of regression. There is linear regression, which is add a straight line, and that straight line should be as close to the points as possible. But as you can see in this cartoon example here, there is no straight line that will approach all of these points. So we need to go to a curve instead of a line, which takes us from linear regression into nonlinear regression. So fit a curve to this point. We're going to take one step beyond nonlinear regression today, which is symbolic regression. So in symbolic regression, we're going to assume we know nothing at all about the relationship between x and y. We just have a question mark on the right-hand side here. So we're still fitting curves, but we're going to do so by creating random equations, y equals some function of x, which will produce a curve, and we want to see how close that curve is to these points. So we're going to do symbolic regression by building up random equations to start, right? So you can start to see the evolutionary algorithm here. We're going to create a population of equations. We want to know how close those equations are to the points. So the problem is symbolic regression. And we're going to solve it using yet another evolutionary algorithm called genetic programming. Genetic programming is unique in terms of its genotype. So in all the evolutionary algorithms we've been talking about so far, the genotype is usually encoded as a vector, or in the case of an evolutionary strategy, maybe a matrix. In the case of genetic programming, we're going to encode the genotype as a tree. So if you're not a computer scientist and you haven't seen a tree before, don't panic. We'll walk you through this. Okay, for simplicity's sake, let's imagine we have a population size of 2. We have just 2 parents to start with. We're going to initialize this population by creating these genotypes at random. How do we do that? Well, we're going to start by creating a bag that's filled with a bunch of potential functions. Trigonometric functions, algebraic functions, doesn't matter. We're going to throw in a bunch of symbols, or otherwise our operators here, which are going to be the building blocks for these equations. We're also going to throw in the variables themselves. So in our case, we're doing y equals f of x, so we'll just put x in the bag. We want to build up equations that are some function of x, so our algorithm is going to have access to x. And we'll also allow it to pull out numbers from the bag. Okay, so let's build P1. We're going to start, P1 is empty. We're going to build the blueprint. How do we do that? We're going to reach into our bag of operators and operands, and we're going to pull something out at random. In this case, we pulled out multiply. Multiply requires 2 arguments, the thing to the left and the right of the multiplication symbol. So we're going to put the multiply here, and we're going to put 2 nodes underneath it. You can see we're starting to build up a tree here. Those circles or those nodes are empty at the moment. How do we fill in those nodes?
Pull from the bag.
Pull from the bag. We reach back into the bag. In this case, we pull out a plus, which also requires 2 nodes underneath it. We reach into the bag again, pull out a 0.8 at random. We pull out an x. This one is still empty. We reach into the bag again and pull out 1.4. We've pulled out things that don't require any more arguments, so we're done. We built a tree at random. We're going to do the same thing for P2. Reach into the bag, pull out division, reach in, pull out 0.2, reach in, pull out plus. Plus requires 2 arguments. We reach in again and pull out x and y, or x and x, doesn't really matter for our purposes. We have 2 random equations. Question?
Is repetition allowed?
I'm sorry?
Is repetition allowed? Like, would you have 2 dividers?
Yeah, you could have 2 dividers. Yeah, sorry. This is, you're reaching into the bag with replacement. You could pull out the same operator again. Good question. Okay, so we have these 2 equations, which they're represented here in tree form, but we can also write them as equations. As you can imagine, because these are random equations, they're not going to do a very good job of producing a curve that is very close to the points. For our purposes at the moment, fitness is how close that curve approaches to the points. Probably not very well. But maybe these 2 parents, and imagine there's a whole bunch of other parents in the population now. Imagine these 2 are pretty good. So we're going to take these 2. These have survived, and they're going to be able to produce child equations. So we can introduce a mutation, for example. We can choose a particular node in the child, when we copy the parent and produce the identical equation, we can pick a node, erase whatever is there, and reach into the bag again. So we're simulating mutation. Or we can again introduce the idea of recombination. We can, if we select these two parents to reproduce, we choose at random some point in P1, which in this case is the red node, and we choose some point at random in the second parent, which in this case is the blue node. Those two nodes may or may not have additional material underneath. As you can see in this example, P2 does, P1 doesn't. So we're going to, when we produce these two children, we're going to unplug these two trees, these two subtrees, these two parts of the equations. And as you can imagine, we just swap their position. So if you look at C1, it mostly resembles parent 1, but it's now inherited at this position, the genetic material from P2 down here. C2 mostly resembles P1, but at this point where recombination occurs, it's now inheriting genetic material from P1. So genetic programming encodes genotypes as trees rather than vectors. But in this data structure, we can also simulate mutation and sexual recombination. What do you think the chances are that these two child equations or child curves approach the points any closer than the two parents do? It's not very likely, right? We're still cutting max and PCs in half and trying to glue them together. Still doesn't work very well. We'll come back to that later. But with enough mutation and recombination, you can get genetic programming to work. So let's now take this tool, genetic programming, and apply it to this problem, symbolic regression, and see how it works. So here's our little cartoon example here with our points. We have a whole bunch of observations, the X, and results of those observations. We observed something at value minus 0.4, and the observation we got back was 1.4. We construct our cloud of points, and our genetic programming algorithm starts running. Maybe in the initial population, it actually just comes up, it reaches into the bag when it's creating a random equation and pulls out X. That's it. That's the equation, y equals X. It's done. It's pretty bad, but not that terrible. You can imagine worse curves. So it's got relatively low fitness, which is high error. So let's talk about fitness and error for a moment. We need to measure the quality of this curve. So we draw the curve, and then at each position of X, we measure the distance between the y value, the actual y value at that point, and the predicted y value. So what regression is really doing is giving you back a model of the data. The model is the curve, and you can then use that model to make predictions. So we can ask the model, hey model, for this value of X, what do you think the value of Y is? And as you can see in this cartoon example here, the predicted Y is very different from the actual Y, the actual observation. So high error at that point. At this position of X, the prediction of the model is actually pretty close to the actual observation. It's pretty good. So if we draw these vertical lines that connect the actual observation to the predicted Y at that point, we can visually see the amount of error. It's the sum of all of these lines. So high error is going to be low fitness in our case. As you'll see when we continue talking about evolutionary robotics, we can talk about error or fitness. If we evolve a robot to move as quickly as possible away from the origin, then the distance it gets from the origin is its fitness. The more distance, the more its fitness. Alternatively, we can place a desired object in the environment and ask how close the robot gets to that object, and the distance away from the object is the error. How bad it did at approaching the object. So we can either evolve robots to climb up peaks of higher and higher fitness, or if you flip the fitness landscape upside down, you can think about points as trying to descend to lower and lower error. Mathematically, they're equivalent to one another. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. Okay. As you will all have obviously realized from remembering your high school algebra, the best solution you could probably come up with to these points is x minus 3 squared. But even this is not perfect. There's still some error here. So we could draw another line that swoops down and then does a 180, comes back and hits this point, does another 180, hits this point, this point, this point, this point, this point, this point. Could imagine a curve that gets 0 error. And if you run genetic programming for long enough, it will probably build a very high order polynomial for you that does exactly that. Hits every point and gets low error, 0 error. Perfect. What could possibly go wrong?
That's overfitting.
It's called overfitting, and you see this in, it always shows up in most machine learning algorithms, but it takes different forms in different algorithms. You can see in genetic programming, if we keep running it, you get the same problem. Why is it overfitting? It's fitting the data perfectly, but overfitting it, meaning that once we have the curve and we go back out into nature and get a new observation at a new value of x here, a new xy pair, what is the likelihood that the prediction of this very complex curve is going to be correct? Pretty bad, right? So there is no final exam in this course, but if there were, and I made all previous final exams available to you, and you didn't study, and you panicked the night before, and instead of studying all 29 lectures, you just memorized all past exams, assuming that I use questions from past years, you'll do fine. But if I don't, it's unlikely that if you see a new question on this year's final exam that you'll do well. So machine learning algorithms, like overtaxed students, will often fall into the trap of deciding to overfit and memorize rather than trying to see the underlying pattern from all the examples. Yes?
Couldn't you argue, though, that if somebody, at least a person, were to actually diligently study however many past exams you had, that they would actually properly learn the material?
Good question. Maybe. How many questions are we talking about? Right? It depends on how complicated the phenomenon is. If the phenomenon is simple, then yeah, memorization is maybe enough. We just have a few points here, and there's no need to produce an overly complex curve. But for most modern problems that we're interested in, they're complex. They have fitness landscapes that look like this, and there is no amount of data we could collect during the lifetime of the universe that would allow it to see the pattern under the data. It would usually choose to overfit instead.
Would a better analogy be the Scantron results of the previous tests, just the answers?
You need to know the question and answer pair because you need to recognize the question, right? You need to see X and Y.
Could you almost say that overfitting is kind of like the quantitative version of the Chinese room in the sense that it doesn't actually know what the pattern is, it's just responding to what's already in the book? I guess if you think of the Chinese room, like what if someone passes in Chinese word that's not in the book?
Yeah.
Now what do I do?
Good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there is a connection between overfitting and the Chinese room problem, where the Chinese room problem was originally described as this lookup table, right? This Mandarin to Mandarin dictionary. We would like, in theory, the thing inside the Chinese room, which could be a machine learning algorithm or genetic programming, to not memorize the examples, but to come up with a curve. There's some pattern in the Mandarin to Mandarin dictionary where I don't need the dictionary itself. Once I know the rules, off I go. Okay. Again, we could spend a lot of time talking about overfitting. The dirty little secret of machine learning is nobody knows how to solve this problem. How do we know how to balance low error against overfitting? There's no easy way to do this for now. Okay, let's look at a real example. If any of you stay if you stay in the summer in the Champlain Valley, there will be at certain times of the summer in Lake Champlain, certain bays are infected by toxic algal blooms, and you definitely don't want to go swimming there. We know a lot about toxic algal blooms. We know that nitrogen and phosphorus that's washed off farmers' fields into the lake tends to produce algal blooms. But it turns out that just measuring the amount of nitrogen in the lake or just measuring the amount of phosphorus is not predictive. It's sort of the equivalent of producing y equals x. It explains some of what's going on in the lake, but not enough. There was a study years ago that showed actually the ratio of N to P and N and P together are better at predicting algal blooms than N or P alone. And the moment that result came out, everyone was very excited. We are now better at predicting toxic algal blooms. But those that were familiar with machine learning said, wait a second. If N alone or P alone is not good at predicting algal blooms, but the ratio is better, maybe there's something beyond the ratio that's even better at predicting toxic algal blooms. Maybe the water temperature today and last week and last month will help us with our predictions. Maybe the turbidity. So if you look down through a body of water, the depth to which you can see is the inverse of turbidity. Rainfall matters. There's dozens of other variables, of other x's you can imagine. So some colleagues here at UVM years ago actually collected a lot of this data. And we can now apply genetic programming to produce an equation T equals X, where T is the total amount of toxic algal bloom at a particular point in time in the lake. And genetic programming is actually pretty good at this. If you run this with this data set, you will see N over P appearing in the equation after some generations of evolution, because genetic programming rediscovers that the ratio matters. But it starts to add on additional terms which also predict algal blooms in the data set. And sometimes it's good at predicting future algal blooms. Not very good at the moment, because as you can imagine, this is a horrendously complicated problem. But with enough data and with enough variables as the years go by, maybe we can get better and better at predicting toxic algal blooms. And maybe if we can read off this equation, we can start to derive some policy about how to regulate what goes into the lake to minimize toxic algal blooms. We now know that just the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus doesn't cut it. So instead of forcing farmers to use less phosphorus on their fields, maybe there's a more complex solution which is also less taxing on the farmers and the other stakeholders of the lake. That's the hope, at least, right? So that's the why of genetic programming. We would like to be able to understand why toxic algal blooms occur. The answer, whatever it is probably going to be complicated. But once we understand that problem, maybe we can come up with some implementable solutions to the problem. We'll see. Let's have a look at a completely different application of genetic programming. After class, if you go Google genetic programming and Mona Lisa, you can see this evolutionary algorithm in action. It's beautiful to watch, and it's also a great visual illustration of how genetic programming works. Up till now, we've been talking about genetic programming that encodes equations as trees. But genetic programming can also encode other things as trees, other than equations. In this case, what you're looking at in the middle and the right panel are the phenotypes, the things that are produced by a GP tree. So any one GP tree in the population produces one of these images. What's the genotype? What are the trees encoding?
RGB values.
Could be RGB values, but if you look carefully, this is not a, we're not looking at white noise, random RGB values of pixels that are gradually resolving into Mona Lisa. So looking carefully at these panels gives you a hint about how these solutions are being encoded. They're not being encoded as RGB pixels in the tree. You could, but you'd have a pretty big tree. How is it encoding these images?
Maybe like features like hair and facial features?
Possibly. Could be hairs or facial features, but again, you'll notice there's some visual clues in here.
Is it an equation where the pixel intensity is a function of the row and column of the pixel position in the image?
Not quite. Other ideas here? Yes?
That's shapes.
Shapes, right? If you look carefully, and this may be hard to see from the back, but each of these images is a whole bunch of shapes laid on top of one another. What are those shapes? Let's see if we can be a little bit more specific.
Triangles?
Triangles, I think in this case it's actually polygons. Okay, so you can think about a tree, and that tree has a whole bunch of subtrees, and instead of a subtree encoding a sub-equation, each subtree here encodes the vertices of a polygon, the x and y vertices that describe a polygon. So if you have a tree with n subtrees, it's going to lay n polygons on top of one another. Each polygon subtree, however, is not just encoding the shape of that polygon. What else is it encoding?
The color?
The color. So now we have an RGB also. So each tree says, draw a polygon like this and fill it in with this color. One additional detail. There's one additional piece of information that is stored in each polygon. Anyone who's familiar with computer graphics might be able to figure this out. Transparency, or the alpha value, right? How transparent or how translucent it is, so that if you lay two polygons of different color on top of one another, and both of them are somewhat translucent, the colors will mix a little bit in the final image. Yeah? Okay, so it's kind of just a fun application of genetic programming, which gives you an intuition for how this works. You can imagine a mutation to a polygon, which alters the phenotype, which is the image. So remember this distinction between genotype and phenotype. The genotype is a tree that encodes polygons, their color, and their transparency. And the phenotype is a pixel array with an RGB value associated with each pixel. We're going to translate the genotype into the phenotype. Question?
Are the positions fixed?
The positions are not fixed. So when a parent tree is randomly modified, copied into a child tree, mutation can alter a vertex in a polygon, which changes the shape of that polygon. It can alter the color, it can alter the transparency. It can also, mutation in this case, can also add or remove a polygon. It's not immediately clear how many polygons you need to approximate an image of the Mona Lisa. So again, let's let evolution decide. So again, kind of a fun example, but is there maybe a practical application of this? Why polygons to encode images?
It allows for compression.
Compression. So again, you may not be able to see unless you look at these series of images pretty close, but some of these last images here, they're pretty good approximations of the Mona Lisa with relatively few polygons. If we wanted to store a description of the Mona Lisa in a file, we could store the RGB value of every pixel, but that's a lot of information. If instead we said we want Mona Lisa within 99% accuracy, and we set GP to work on this, and it came up with a set of polygons that approximated to 99%, the amount of information in that tree is probably less than the RGB values of the full Mona Lisa. So could we actually use this for compression? Possibly. Okay, so that ends our discussion on evolutionary algorithms. Of course, this was a very rough treatment of a very vast field. A few takeaways from this. We're balancing the simplicity of the algorithm, like the hill climber, versus much more complex algorithms like CMAES and genetic programming. We're balancing the complexity against the likelihood that the algorithm will get stuck on local optima. Right? We're trying to strike that balance. And along the way, we're trying to ensure that our algorithm doesn't overfit. And to make those decisions, we need to think carefully about how to encode the blueprint of a potential solution and how to translate it from the genotype into the phenotype. We'll come back and talk about those things later. We got 5 minutes left, so we'll just start in on our discussion of physical simulation. I apologize, I didn't put the slides up for lecture 6 until this morning. We're just going to go through the first few slides and then we'll continue next time. So, third tool of the trade is the physics engine, right? We know how to create virtual robots. We know how to create neural networks. We want to wrap them in some evolutionary algorithm. But how do we evaluate the fitness of a robot? We could try and build hundreds or thousands or millions of robots and evaluate them in the real world. one after the other, but no research lab or even Google has enough money to finance such a project. So instead, let's evolve our robots in simulation. And once we get a robot that is good enough in simulation, we'll take it and try and build it in reality and hope that we cross the reality gap. We hope that we create a robot in reality that does what we saw in simulation. The sim to real gap is an open problem in robotics, and we'll talk about it later in the course. For now, we're going to work on simulation. So what do we mean by simulating a robot? We're going to use a physics engine. A physics engine differs from 3D computer graphics. Anyone who's worked with CAD or done any of this before. In old school computer graphics, if you wanted to create a virtual scene, you would define a series of objects, and you would tell the computer the position, orientation, and shape of each object at each point in time in the animation. You would then render that scene at the next. You would render that scene at the next scene. You'd tell the computer the new position, orientation, and shape of every object in the scene. As you can imagine, this is a fantastically labor-intensive process. So starting in the late 90s and about 2000, you started to see the emergence of physics engines. And physics engines were invented primarily for computer games, because computer games at that time were basically doing what you see on the right. The idea underlying all physics engines, and again, like evolutionary algorithms, they all differ, but they have one thing in common, which is force equals mass times acceleration. So what do we mean by that? In a physics engine, as you've kind of already seen, you start by defining the initial position and orientation and shape of the objects, but you define not just the geometric properties of the objects, but also their physical properties. What is their mass? What is their friction properties? If they come into contact with another object, how do those two objects relate to one another? Are you simulating steel ball bearings, or are you simulating spheres that are wrapped in rough paper, sandpaper? It's a very rough friction. We also need to tell the physical simulator how these objects are attached together with joints, and we'll talk about joints in a moment. And then you click go. And now you can sit back and you no longer need to define what happens at the next time step. The physics engine figures it out on its own. How does the physics engine do that? Well, basically, it takes every object that's in the simulator. It knows the mass of those objects. And it also knows, at that point in time, all the forces that are acting on that object. So one force that's acting on all objects in the physical simulator is gravity. So if we have an object, we place it at this point in time, there is a particular force that is acting on that object, pulling it down at a particular force, which we're going to actually, at the moment, use as acceleration. So we know the acceleration that's pulling on that object. But we're going to assume for the moment that we're going to use the force aspect of gravity. We might have this object attached to another object, and that object is somehow attached to the world. So as this object is being pulled down by gravity, it is also being pulled up by the object to which it's attached. And maybe those two forces cancel out so that the object stays where it is. Yeah? So at any point in time in a physics engine, the physics engine visits each object and computes all of the forces that are acting on that object. And it inverts the force equals mass times acceleration equation into acceleration equals force divided by mass. The physics engine knows the mass for each object in the world, and it now has computed all of the forces that are acting on that object. So dividing those two quantities gives the physics engine the acceleration of that object at the next time step. So at t plus 1, the physics engine knows the previous position of the object. It knows the acceleration, so it can compute the new position of the object. That's the basic idea. When you see your objects moving around in the physics engine, basically that's what's happening. So far, so good? Okay. So what we're going to end with today and start with next time is diving under the hood of our physics engine. So you're working with PyroSim, which is a particular wrapper we created to wrap around a physics engine. So PyroSim is obviously a robot simulator in Python. So what is the simulator itself? PyroSim wraps around a physics engine known as Open Dynamics Engine, or ODE. So the reading for Thursday is actually from the ODE documentation. I do not expect you to memorize all the underlying source code. We're just going to talk about it to give you a taste of what's going on under the hood. When you start up or create a sim variable, when you call PyroSim and say, give me back an empty simulator, this is the code that runs. It creates the simulator itself. It creates this thing called a world. The world is a data structure that contains all the objects. So we just talked about visiting all of the objects. How does the physics engine know what all the objects are? They're all sitting inside this world. We'll talk about the contact space later. It also measures all pairs of objects to see which are in contact with one another and which aren't. Why? Because one of the other important things that a physics engine does, other than computing force equals mass times acceleration, is contact detection, which objects are in contact with one another, and contact resolution. What do I do with two bullets that were fired at each other, and at this particular point in time, they've come into contact with one another? How do I resolve that collision? What are the forces that are acting on those two bullets at the moment that they touch? That is not an easy thing to do, and we'll talk about contacts later. We're going to define a certain gravity for our physics engine. We'll talk about friction later. I think we'll stop there today. You have a quiz due tonight. Undergrads, you're working on assignment 3. Grads, you're working on 5 and 6. And I'll see you all on Thursday. Thank you.